Alright, this is Tapir Table, episode 2 with Yang Muhammad Nik Nazmi, Nik Ahmad, Ahli Parlimen. YB, it's like, what do you make of like today's current affairs, like in KL, for example? It's like, for example, I just recently, after listening to some of your more recent interviews, for example, or statements based on the government's handling of COVID-19 and I wouldn't say plight, but the problems of ordinary Malaysians on the ground in Kuala Lumpur, in the deep cities. What do you make of that? What are the current what are the current issues you think that we have and aspects we have to tackle? Entrepreneurship or policy-wise, monetary, fiscal policy, etc.
Well, I think that it's twofold. When we have the COVID crisis, it's both a health issue that we have to deal with, and since it's a pandemic that, until now, we are looking at a few potential vaccines, but none has been properly deployed yet, other than tests and whatnot that we've seen in the places. So basically, the only way is through physical distancing. So as what we saw, we've had lockdowns or softer versions of lockdowns. In Malaysia, we call it MCO, and then I can't remember the various permutations of the MCO, PKP, pemulihan, PKP, PKPB, conditional, bersyarat, and so on. So, and that's necessary. I mean, undoubtedly, a lot of it is necessary. I mean, I'm not questioning that. Although the details of it, where it was done, like the recent revival of the PKPB, that one is another area to debate. But it is necessary overall, obviously, to combat COVID, right? And especially to the vulnerable elements of society, like the elderly, or those who are not well and all that.
Yeah. But
that creates the other impact of the economic side. Malaysia is a very open country. We are a very small country in the big scheme of things. Having 35 million is relatively small. And we've always been reliant on trade, we've been reliant on tourism. We have people in Johor, for example, who work in Singapore or who are reliant on Singaporean tourists. And we also have similar situations, obviously on a different level, in the north with Thailand and aspects of it with Indonesia and Philippines on Borneo. So, so this creates a very big impact. Schools are, this year most kids have hardly been to school.
Yeah.
Right? And I don't think we've seen a disruption like that since the Second World War. And my father is old enough; he's 90 now. He's old enough to go to school at that time. But basically, it's something that's we haven't witnessed. Most of us in the country have not witnessed. Obviously, today we have technology. We are lucky that we have technology. We can do things like this today without being physically present. But we don't we meet what do you call that? We see every day. I see every day people who are struggling. They have 5 or 6 kids. They have 2 phones each, one for the mother, one for the father. And how do they organize the classes? And that's not even laptops, right? It's just phones. So when you have this, it's very different if you're from the T20. It's very different from the M40, and I guess some of the M40 are also struggling and sort of being on the borderline with the P40. And that's something that's very, very, I think, worrying. So things like inequality, malnutrition, urban poverty. It has existed before COVID, but
Yes.
COVID will make it worse. So I think that's the worrying thing is how after this we will see the younger generation. I think that's something that the government has to tackle, because or not you'll have a lost generation from those who are less fortunate.
You think it's a little premature to call it a lost generation? Certainly a lost year, but
Mm.
how long do you think the repercussions of this will continue if a safe and effective vaccine is launched, say next year?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not saying that it's definitely going to be a lost generation, but it's very risk. The risk is huge for this generation. Again, if you're able to, your parents are able to provide you with internet connection, broadband, what you call that, laptops,
Yeah.
then that's fine, and you can complement it with various ways, right?
Yeah.
But if you're not able to be to do all those things, and again, people always think, yes, and I'm not dismissing. I mean, we have the Viviana story. Her the fact that she was so semangat, to get knowledge, to
Mm.
study, to submit her exams and all that, and what she did. I mean, that's incredible.
Yes.
In Sabah, and that's a lot. You find in Borneo or even in parts of Peninsula, but even in KL, right? I met a boy. And this it's not a big family. He has another brother, but the father only has one phone. So he said the kids fight over who uses the phone. I know instances where students who are otherwise very vocal now have to mute their when they join classes because they are in a very cramped housing where the siblings are making noise and whatnot. So it's not the same. I mean, as much as what do you call that, Steve Jobs or Bill Gates or Zuckerberg likes to think that technology has solved everything, it hasn't.
Yeah.
Certain things need physical. You need to have physical classrooms, and when this sort of things happen, the gap again, as I said, when people who between those who have and don't have gadgets will be bigger. And even then, going back to my earlier point, is that those, sometimes physical classrooms is irreplaceable, even when you have gadgets.
Yes.
That's very interesting when you talk about Viviana. I mean, even though the COVID is really hitting us in a way negatively, but there seems to be a spur of creativity. I mean, the youth, even though there's a loss of 1 year for our generation, but there's something there's another way of thinking of doing things. With all the technologies and the youth are using it. I mean, what are your thoughts on the positive, the creativity, the arts that is being created in the midst of COVID?
Yeah, definitely. We see this semangat of kita jaga kita, which we see everywhere. We see Malaysians of all races, all communities, those who are better off, trying to help those who are not. And I think it's really eye-opening because for some of us who've been blessed, who are not exposed to those sort of things, I mean, what we see, today in this COVID environment is really incredible, and how people cope with it, or how people try to, some out of just pure creativity, some out of utter desperation. They resort to all sorts of things, and I think that is illustrates a lot about human ingenuity, and especially about Malaysians and how we band together. But ultimately, I think it's a bit ironic when sometimes we see even the government talking about kita jaga kita, because to me it's a travesty that kita jaga kita emerged when the government does not fulfill its role. Does not seem to recognize that this is the biggest crisis that the country has faced, economically, socially, since independence, I would say. You know, um, even you talk about 13 May, you talk about Asian financial crisis, global financial crisis. It's not to this extent.
Yes,
People were still going to school.
yes,
We still could welcome tourists. And so this is something that is unimaginable, and I think this is where, because the people are already most people do not have money in their pockets anymore.
yes.
Companies do not have money to spend or even pay their salaries,
They're
or
gone.
invest. Yeah. So the only actor today is the government, right? And they have to play their role to solve the economy. But I wouldn't say that they should do so by printing money.
On that point, YB, I mean, what do you think, like, should the government's role be? Like, what should a government involve itself in or not involve itself in, fiscal policy, etc.? And to what extent do you think that they should? I mean, and even when they're printing money, do you think that they mean something along the lines of a quantitative easing policy, or do you think that it's more of simply a kind of harebrained scheme to just print out money with a kind of casualness, which is quite worrying if you ask me.
Well, if you talk about what I believe a government role should be, I always believe that the government should be there on one hand to spur economic growth, to get the businesses to really push the economy to grow. But in order to do so, the government has to invest in certain sectors, in certain public goods. Education and health are very important factors for me. If you look at how the US developed, although we see today the US as being a very free market country relatively, but the US actually developed on the back of a lot of a strong investment in education. This was 100 years ago, and that was how they overtook Europe.
Yes.
Right? Then even, I mean, one of the things that, and when, every time there's a crisis, there's an opportunity, similar to COVID. And I point out that, I always point this out, that the fact that, the growth that America enjoyed after the Second World War, was a lot of it was from, this high proportion of people going to universities. And a lot of these people, the boomers, right, were actually people who went to were the results of the GIs who went to war, came back, and they were given assistance to go to universities, given scholarships to go to universities, which was not present before in the US.
Yeah.
So they because they felt that they owed it to these veterans, to the GIs who came back from Second World War, who fought for America. So they, for the first time, a lot of young men went to universities, funded by the government, and then they came out and they contributed to the growth. Similarly, Japan or Germany. Germany. They had a lot of when they replaced the currency used during Nazi Germany with the Deutschmark. They actually most of the government debts at that time was forgiven. I think over 90%, and that allowed Germany to clean its slate and move forward, and actually now has overtaken America and Britain in many aspects. Right, so the government has a role to play. Definitely, I don't believe that the government should just sit back and everything should be run by the private sector. So it's important, but it has to be strategic, and they must know where they should play its role. And definitely in times like this, where businesses do not have money, where people do not have money, is the government that has to step in. So that the economy can run. and the government has to regulate. I mean, for so long, Malaysia's model has been a low-wage, low-cost economy. First with our own workers, and when our own workers felt that that pay was not enough, then we sustain it through, which that's understandable. Japan started like that, Korea started like that, Singapore started like that, but they moved on.
Yes.
But for Malaysia, how did we sustain it? We imported a lot of foreign workers,
Yes.
who do the 3D jobs in our country at cheap wages. So I think that's where the government has to step in. BN, after a long time, we pressured them. Finally, came out with the minimum wage. PH improved it a bit. Now there are wage guarantees that are introduced by the government to help companies and workers through COVID. This thing should sustain, right? Germany has this program and all that, because jobs are very crucial, and I think that's something that we must, the government must help to step in. Jobs must be protected and good wages must be secured.
Yes.
Going back to your point on the this printing money and whatnot, I'm not sure. I mean, to be honest, I haven't read the details. I've only seen the stuff that on social media where people trying to play around with the policy and make fun of it. But ultimately, we have to realize. I mean, I do accept that we have to look at a lot of things. But Malaysia is, and I'm for government spending. I'm for government borrowing. That's very clear. But to borrow, to print money, or in quote unquote print money, we have to realize that we are a small economy. We are not the EU.
Yes.
We are not United States of America. We're not Japan. Japan's currency is widely traded. Similarly with the euro, similarly with the dollar. So ringgit is not yen, dollar, or euro. And even in those countries, I think quantitative easing will have an impact on the long run.
Yes.
In the countries, but they are so big that it takes time.
Yes.
We are small. People will just look at. People will just bet against us. So I don't think it's something wise. That's my personal opinion. But we should look at other fiscal measures to stimulate the economy.
It's interesting you say that, because it's like for the US, they do have this ability, this uncanny ability to export the inflation overseas.
And
we don't have that capacity yet.
Yeah, I mean, when they lower their interest rates, for example, it can result in the impact can result in our houses being overpriced, because you have all this cheap money lending in our banks and all that, and people borrowing them and speculating on houses.
Yes.
What I was reading this piece, written a few weeks ago, is that the banks are making profit by the profit after tax by the billions, but there's an ongoing debate about the moratorium extension. I mean, where I don't know where are their losses.
Well, I think we have to put it in perspective, because I think the assets of the banks are also big. So when you look at the profits are in billions, I mean, that's the absolute number. But you have to compare with the size of the banks. So if their asset is so big, then say, I don't know, if the assets are 100B or 200B, then a profit of 2-3B is actually quite small. Okay, so I think those things need to put into perspective. I don't have the numbers in my head right now, but I do agree that that there needs to that people need to relook deeply into, for example, the moratorium. On one hand, I think the government did say that it was, one of our policy was a blanket moratorium. And I think a blanket moratorium is a bit tricky moving forward, because why should someone who earns 20-30K be entitled to a moratorium? Someone who's using it for his second or third house, or his Mercedes or BMW, why should they be entitled to the moratorium? But if someone is buying their first house, someone is earning 10K or below, then it's understandable, right? So it has to be more selective. Why is it, because now times are bad, you have pilots losing their jobs,
Yes.
people in the tourism industry, the hoteliers, well, basically it has an impact everywhere, right? So,
Yes.
so to me, what the moratorium did was it delayed a lot of non-performing loans from showing up in the books of the banks. So that was actually good for the banks,
Mm.
because if there was no moratorium, you will see the NPL showing faster on the balance sheets. But now the fact that it's a reprieve. It's sort of a staggered sort of thing. But it will eventually, at the end of the day, you cannot run away from it.
Yeah.
The hope is obviously that there will be. I mean, the government talks about a V-shaped recovery. I don't think it's going to be that simple. But yeah, yeah. So I think that was beneficial for the banks, the moratorium in that sense. But I can understand that a blanket moratorium is not just problematic for the banks, but also I think is something that we need to think deeper. Yes, I mean you can request not to be exempted. You can request to be exempted. But when you take an effort, it's just like Malaysians with RSVP, right? So no one bothers to make the effort. So you can see. I mean, I'm sure. I know a lot of people who could afford to pay their banks during the moratorium, but just because they got it and they didn't they didn't bother to write in, then they just they enjoyed the moratorium as well.
How would you solve that? Because Korea just initiated an experimental phase of universal basic income, where even everybody from the someone who's struggling working in a shop to millionaires will get these basic income coupons or basic income payouts to spend on basically local shops. So obviously you can't spend it on very expensive foreign franchise, but you can spend it on your local pasar mini, etc. Do you think that's something we should try out? Do you think that's something that would benefit people in KL?
I think we should. I mean, universal basic income, if you want to talk about going back to the concept of it where it's everyone will get it, I don't think we are there yet. I think it's an interesting idea, something that we should look at with growing unemployment or underemployment. But more targeted or means-tested assistance is good, and putting money into the hands of the citizens, and I think what Korea is doing, and Korea was one of the successful countries. They even did an election during COVID, and I think the government did better. I think there was talk of the government actually they would have done worse. It was not because of COVID, but because the way the government handled COVID, they got a lot of credit for that, and the government had a Green New Deal and etc. etc. So I think this is a good idea in the sense that and one, it gives money into the pocket of the citizens. Second is that can only be spent in the domestic market to cut the outflow of money. So I think that is something that we really need to consider. And in Malaysia, something that we really need to look at. There's a lot of pressure from companies, and the government is relenting to a certain extent. Is on the foreign workers.
Yes.
Because that's a massive thing. I can understand. It's not something that you can have immediately.
Yes.
But it is something that we need to seriously look into. The process has to be streamlined. For political reasons, foreign workers is placed under Home Ministry.
Yes.
Under immigration.
Yes.
Because Home Ministry traditionally is UMNO.
Yes.
Okay. This of course before PH and PN lah. Now PN is a different system. But human resources under MIC.
Yes.
So what do you call that? Foreign worker permits are seen in Malaysia. It's not seen as we really need foreign workers for this sector or for that sector. The way they see it is, we have an election coming, or we have a party election coming, so we need to give a lot of permits out, because there's a lot of money involved. There's agents, there are brokers,
Yes.
you know.
Yes.
So that's the problem. And I think definitely we need foreign workers. I'm not saying we can have, no country can have, can survive without foreign workers, any developing country.
Yes.
I accept there are jobs that Malaysians won't do,
Yes.
but okay, if we do pay our workers higher, we regulate better. I'm sure there are more people who are willing to do it. When people say that Malaysians are not willing to do the dirty, dangerous, and difficult jobs, people like to use we have a lot of Malaysians working as janitors in Singapore. We also have apple pickers in Australia.
Yes.
Okay, Malaysians. But they won't pick kelapa sawit in their parents' house.
Yes.
Because it's the wages are bad, and there's a lot of abuse. I mean, we see all the documentary and all that, and that's why now our palm oil, for example, is facing problems abroad. But also another thing that people do not mention, and that another thing is that not just Malaysian, but Malays do not like dirty, dangerous, and difficult jobs. But again, that's not true, because oil and gas. Okay, oil and gas. I'm not talking about working in KLCC.
Yes.
They used to make a lot of money, not so much now.
Yes.
But I'm talking about working on the rigs.
Yes.
I'm talking about working on the ships.
Yes.
And there's a lot of not just Malays, but even Iban, Sabahans. A lot of them are doing those jobs, and they get paid well. I mean, we know, like welders can get 10, 20K easily, underwater welders. But even on the rigs, you can get easily, I guess, 5 to 7K, and a lot of them are Malays and Malaysians. But the pay is good, oil and gas. So when I disagree with the notion, it's just the issue of pay. But yes, I mean, I know. So if you pay right now, definitely 1,002, 1,005 you pay for someone working in a restaurant even.
Yes.
Well, maybe now you can get some, but I know it's even difficult. But for many, it's just not worth. They find it troublesome, and I think that's something we need to bite the bullet. But you can see the trouble when PH wanted to increase our minimum wage by 50 ringgit, or for the urban areas. The Federation of Manufacturing was just jumping up and down. 50 ringgit, right? And so that is that I think we really have to face it.
That really goes back to the idea of education, isn't it? Because it's interesting that we've come to this topic, because it leads to a few different things. The first is the World Economic Forum, for example, just put out that I think it's somewhere in 2030 or 2050, we're going to lose about 50% of the human workforce due to obsolescence, right? So all of these people need to be reskilled. And all of this always goes back to our economic policy, yes, but also our educational policy. And it's like you have been on the record talking about education, for example, and how to get kids in school, how to educate them. What do you think is the future? What do we have to sort of reform in our education system? Because it's obvious that the current education system isn't, I'm not going to say that it's inadequate or insufficient, but it doesn't address the ever-changing landscape of the dynamic job markets. I mean, now you have people who are selling online, and they have online marketing. People are teaching online. People are learning online. People are learning how to build things online, etc., and build new things that we can't even think of right now. So it's like, what do you think is the what do you think the future of education reform in Malaysia should be?
I just like to add a little bit. So even in Malaysia education, these past few years, we have lot of graduates, more than 10,000, I would assume, per year. And then from our education policy, we tend to try to get a certain KPI to produce a lot of engineers, a lot of doctors, and this may cause a problem with the issue of supply and demand. That's where when you have an oversupply, and then since the demand is not met, that's where they say, okay, let's just scale down their wages, and then you tend to have a surplus of graduates that's not getting jobs.
Yeah.
So yeah, back to Johan's question about what's the future of kind of education and policy you see is a better one.
Um, the there are sectors where the government where we need to hire more people. For example, teachers. There's a lot of unemployment. I mean, well, not unemployment, but teaching graduates, sarjana muda pendidikan, who finish, they graduate, but they don't get places as teachers. And it's a big issue, affecting both public and private institutions. I think, we what do you call that? Certain our actually national average in terms of student teacher ratio is not that bad, but that is because it's an average. So we have schools where they panggil SKM, sekolah kurang murid.
Yes.
For example, one Chinese school in Bukit Fraser at one point had one student. So it's like almost as good as Oxford, where you have one-on-one, tutorials with the headmaster and who doubles as so that's actually a real issue. So that is one. I mean, we know that we have an excess of doctors as well. So I think those are selective. Again, going back to the fundamental roles of government, investing in health and education. Those are areas where I think government should hire more. And even if the government, I can understand, permanent hiring in government is difficult because it then creates a stress on pension, or whatnot. Or if it's, I don't know, I mean, now maybe there's no pension, but EPF, for example. But even that permanency, right, that 30 years of job guarantee. So if that is difficult for the government, they can hire them on contract. And government has that power. They don't have to take everyone permanent. They can take guru interim, they can take doctor contract, whatever. And it's been done, in fact, now to cut costs. So, but they should generate jobs more.
What kind of assurance?
Yes. Sorry?
What kind of assurance can people have? Please continue your point, but just to select one more thing. What kind of assurance can people have that these pension funds are actually safe when even in developed countries like in Europe, in the UK or in the US, these pension funds are constantly at risk?
It's not. I mean, if you ask me, it's not. I mean, we know the numbers. I mean, it was even at one point involved in 1 MDB.
Yeah.
Right? So, but the issue is the problem for the government with pension schemes, understandably, is because in Malaysia, you're guaranteed, for life. People are also living longer. So that creates that problem. Whereas the EPF way is different. It's based on your contribution. So, but going back to that, there is, I admit, while teachers, what we call that, certain jobs, maybe in STEM sectors, and then doctors, those are necessary. But otherwise, then we need to relook at it. Malaysia has this Anglo-Saxon obsession with universities.
Yes.
And if you look at for example, in Germany, Germany has free higher education. How are they able to sustain it? Is by sending only about, I think, less than 30% of people go to university. So then they can afford free higher education. The rest then go into skills, right? But obviously when you go to skills, you do your what you call that, dual training program and all that, they end up with middle class jobs. They are plumbers, they are opticians, they are, they repair houses, but they get a middle class job.
Yes.
So in Malaysia, we can understand at the beginning we were short of graduates, right? Yes. So we built universities, especially after the new economic policy. We send students abroad.
Mm-hmm.
So we send a lot of, especially Malay students abroad. We build local universities, but it's sort of, because then we because of the new economic policy, we give preferential status to the Bumi Putra for admission to local unis. Yes. Then to make the non-Malays happy, then we liberated the private colleges.
Mm-hmm.
So that's the history of it. Then government realized, why should we build so many government universities? There's private colleges. Less burden on the government. But then who will pay for them? Then the argument said, what about Malays? Because Malays tend to be less affluent. So PTPTN was created.
Yes.
Okay? And when PTPTN was created, again, we have many top private unis. Anway, Uni, UTP, MMU, Taylors. I guess those are the better universities. But there are also many Mickey Mouse colleges. I wouldn't name them, but the Mickey Mouse colleges, they are in Rumah Kedai. Yes. They offer all sorts of funny training, some with twinning with unreputable foreign universities.
Yes.
And we have created this thing, kalau nak pandai, pergi university. Right? And if you don't go to university, there's something wrong with you. So even if you have to take a debt, right? Even if you have to take a debt with PTPTN, you take it. And it becomes a situation similar to the US, right? Where you have those students paying so much for tuition fees.
Yes.
Then once they graduate, then they realize that their certs are not attractive. Or even if their certs are okay, the jobs are not there.
Yes.
But then they already have their debt. And they end up, some of them, they end up working at 7-Eleven alongside their friend who, after SPM, decided to go straight to 7-Eleven and maybe end up as a supervisor or something and a bit more than that.
Yeah.
And they still have to pay their PTPT and debt. Right? And so that is, I think, where we need to relook. I think PTPTN is a massive problem. That's why, for example, one of the solutions we proposed last time was, and I think PH was about to enforce it just before we collapsed, was that situation where only those earning 4,000 and above, a comfortable graduate's pay, have to pay back PTPTN. It's similar to what's done in Australia. It's similar to what's done in the UK. So because if you graduate and you are earning 2K, then there's something wrong with the education system. Maybe that's fine if you earn 2K for a few years, but if you keep earning 2K for 10 years, there's something wrong, and you shouldn't be penalized for that, right? So I think that is where we need to relook at it. A lot of private colleges, now I guess a lot of them are closing down anyway because of COVID, right? But the government needs to be really strict and really needs to look at skills. I know the government is trying, but it has to be more concerted. There is a problem because it's under Kementerian Sumber Manusia, it's under Kementerian Pendidikan, it's under Kementerian Belia dan Sukan. I'm not sure if there are any other kementerian involved as well. But I think that's better than this talk of entrepreneurship. Entrepreneurship is a bonus, right? But you can't. Entrepreneurship is is part of it, but you have to be supported by skills, by knowledge, and that's where universities and skills colleges come in. So you cannot expect, we teach you in a university for 3 years, we add some entrepreneurship classes, and you'll be a businessman. Zuckerberg, Bill Gates, they didn't go to entrepreneurship classes, right? They didn't even finish their university, and they became rich. So that, this idea that obsession with teaching enterprise is off.
Let's move on to something else. on education, but I want to ask you, because I've heard that you are an avid philosopher, YB, and that you are interested in such classics such as Hobbes and etc. on the Leviathan. So it's like, what do you think of? But on the topic of philosophy, what do you think of a liberal arts education in Malaysia, for example? Do you think it's required? Do you think that Malaysians should be taught how to think and not how to think. Not what to think, but how to think, on how to process issues, how to accurately look at events and look at cycles in economics and politics, so that they don't end up being so dependent on, let's say, pundits in the media or political propaganda in order to make sense of events, and they are able to better adapt to the changing changes in human society. And as our country moves on, progresses, as it chugs along, as our civilization improves, what do you think of adding this into a Malaysian kind of curriculum? Because it's interesting to talk about skills, but skills are going to be outdated anyway. I mean, like, you're a lawyer, law grad, YB, yeah. Law grad, YB. I too have an LLB, and it's no secret that, for example, in technology, the law will always be 6 years behind any technological progress. It's always going to be outdated, and it's not going to be abreast with all of these things. And it's like it requires a sense of a kind of individual learning to just constantly keep up with this and read, etc., and to self-learning. So what do you think? Do you think this would be more useful and more beneficial for the rakyat? Obviously, it's not going to probably help every single person, but maybe for the more the ones who are already in the middle classes, who have these kinds of facilities, who have the capacity and the ability to pursue such things and such experts. What do you think?
Well, I'm more of a Rawlsian fan rather than Hobbes, actually. Yes. But John Rawls. But yeah, I mean, I think when you talk about it, even, for example, in traditional or classical Islamic curriculum, you go to the madrasas, you go to the pesantrens, something that we've had since Imam Ghazali and all that, is even elements from Aristotelian philosophy. Yes. Of course, there's some debate about when Islam or Muslims rather started to be less open to philosophy, but definitely it's much less evident in modern curriculum. So you go to a pondok, it's funny that they still teach those things, mantik, logic, and all that many, maybe some modern universities that teach Islamic studies ignore. And I think then we have this flip side. On the other hand, we had this obsession. I was from a boarding school, and later on they did adjust it. But during my time, for example, we no longer had we all had to take pure science, right? So I personally, I felt that it was beneficial for me. But I was not a fan. I ended up doing law. I did econs and history and maths in A levels. But for this idea that if you're smart, you do science and maths, right? Yes, so the traditional one is obviously, if you're super smart, you become a doctor. Yeah. If you lack bio or chem, then you become an engineer. If you lack those things, but you're still good in maths, you become an accountant. And if you are good in English and BM and back in other subjects, you become a lawyer, right? So that is the for occupation of a successful Malaysian traditionally. So I think that needs to be done away with. So science and maths is important. I'm not trying to dismiss it, but I think we need to get people who do these subjects as well to look at the liberal arts. We should get more people we have to reserve more places as well, smaller than those doing science and maths, the STEM subjects. But we need to do people who do history, who do philosophy, political science, international science, because or not, you will have quote unquote, those who are smart, all ending up one sector, and those who are not smart ending up being leading, even some of them ending up in politics, for example, right? So my point is that you need to open up and create this discourse, because we see, even if you look at those who I'm not generalizing, but there are incidences where some of those who engage in terrorism, for example, some of them are those who study engineering, and then suddenly they rediscovered religion, quote unquote, but they look at it from a very black and white sort of perspective. So we need that. Yeah.
I know a particular person who did that. I think it was Luther, the guy who started the Reformation. He was supposed to study science, but then he went into religion, which is very interesting.
And sparked the whole debate.
When you said about the mentality that you are engineer for life, you are accounting for life, you are doctor for life. Nowadays, what you see is a pattern of they are doing a lot of things. I mean, one of the books I read was from Dr. Byung-Chul Han. He called a small pamphlet called The Burnout Society. He said that the current youth, in its effort to survive, have changed the language from the previous generation would use the word you should do this, you should do this, you should do this in order to do something, But in our current generation, given a problem, they say, oh, can do. It's all can do. At that point, they overwork themselves, and at one point, it will be like a flip of a coin. They'll say, there'll be a burnout. They say, we cannot do anything anymore. I mean, there are these things happening to the youth today, which I'm actually witnessing myself that's happening to some of my friends. And then, this type of problems will come to hit us in the future. This burnout youth, I mean, they're going to turn out very bitter when they get older. So, I mean, what approach should we take to cure, to at least solve this problem in the future, to prevent from a bitter society in the future?
There's no easy solution, I guess, but I mean, if for example, in the past you have a job for life, in Japan, for example, you start in Honda, you'll end up in Honda, you'll get a nice salary. I mean, it's not big, but it's steady. You're not worried about unemployment. And I guess it was the case for Malaysia as well. You got a job, for example, in a GLC. It was seen as a job for life. Now it's increasingly difficult. And sorry, going back earlier to an earlier point, there was this, when I was graduating, the most popular job for any graduate, regardless of what they studied, they may even be a medical grad, was to actually be an investment banker. Okay, and then we had the global financial crisis of 2009, right? Because they created all these funny derivatives and all stuff that destroyed the economy. So I think that we need to the most fundamental thing. There's a few elements: economy, spiritual, and I mean, those two aspects are important. And but from an economic perspective, I think we cannot ignore inequality, right? So if again, is universal basic income a solution if job security is no longer widespread? Um, well, we have unemployment insurance in Malaysia, but does it go far enough? So those sort of things that if we lose our jobs, then we have something to fall back to. We cannot stop the disruption, right? We cannot say we'll stop new innovation, we'll stop new social media, new new tech stuff from coming in. That's a bit difficult. But how do you create an economy that's humane enough, that allows people? I mean, it's not perfect. They have many problems of their own, but I think in many ways, the Nordic or Scandinavian models are something that we can learn from. You were talking about losing jobs and all that. In Germany or in the Nordic countries, workers, they have, I think, a third or more of representation on the board of directors. They must represent the workers, right? And so it does not exist in the Anglo-Saxon economic model or even the French economic model. So as a result, in the other capitalist models, and which we follow, if you want to increase the salary to the CEO or whatever on the basis of retaining talent to remain competitive, because he's good at getting the bottom line, then no one will speak up against it. I mean, it's unlikely. But if you have workers there, and they are earning, right, maybe the workers, the starting pay is, if you talk about a graduate, is maybe 3K and a non-grad is 1.5K, and suddenly you want to pay the CEO 200-300K a month, then I don't think it will carry through. So I think those are some things that we can look at to make it more humane, to protect the workers and not look at them as just units of production, but look at them as human beings that matter.
I'm just wondering, is the human way you're looking at, whether you are taking it from any particular philosophers, just for for my own reading because what you are saying is very interesting.
Well, I am reading. I haven't finished yet. I am reading now Piketty's Capital and Ideology. Not the first book, Capital, but his second book, Capital and Ideology, which is also long. I'm only halfway through, but it is much more readable. And he was exploring at how, when you say inequality is inevitable, he argues against it. He says ideology is what makes you accept or reject inequality. So he said that if you shape an ideology that is more equitable, then the system will follow through. But what we have globally right now, unfortunately, is something on the other side.
I mean, okay, that's quite interesting, because it's like it goes towards how we view kind of like governance, whether it's corporate governance or whether it's the governance of the nation itself and of human beings, as you say. What do you think of like this kind of like what do you think of like the system of governance in Malaysia, and obviously well, in relation to how it is now, how with the current government, which some people call backdoor, some people say is legitimate. And you mentioned kita jaga kita, right? So it's like, when kita jaga kita, there are two ways of looking at it. You can look at it as everybody looking after everyone else in a kind of this kind of like in this the masses looking out for each other in a democratic kind of way, or it's also kita jaga kita in an oligarchic kind of way. It's just us. It's like people say, oh, justice, yes, it's just us among the few. And do you think that it's like, in terms of like oligarchy, there's a Dr. Ronald Syme, I believe he was from the Oxford University, and he wrote something very interesting. He was commenting on political science, and it's a civilizational argument. And he says that language of politics knows good words and bad. and he says that in terms of language, for the Greeks, it went back to Herodotus, and in terms of politics, you can look at Aristotle in his Politics. He says that there's 4 kinds of oligarchy and 4 kinds of democracy, and that it's important to see that there's an in between there. There's a gray side to that. It's not black and white. Democracy is good, and oligarchy is bad, etc. It's combining the best features of each, which he says he calls it the politeia, a genuine republican government, which I wouldn't call it perfect governance, but it's an ideal setup. Now, when I say republicanism, I don't mean that the republicanism in the very modern sense, where there is no such thing as a king, etc. Because that would probably be impractical, unworkable in our context as Malaysians. But what do you think of that, YB, in terms of like governance? Or do you think that society is spiraling out of control, and that one day we could even end up with a military junta, which I personally think is unlikely, but these are all possibilities that we as the rakyat, and you as a lawmaker and as a representative of your constituency, we have to think about these things, because otherwise we run the risk of losing our liberty and ourselves as human beings. You think? What do you think?
Even the US, even the recent election about Biden and Donald Trump. There's weird things going on. So what about Malaysia?
I think that's why it's very crucial. We've seen Donald Trump, we've seen Brexit. If you do not address the concerns of the working people, the social democrat, I would say that I'm largely, when you talk about wrongs, when you talk about, where my leanings are, that's where my leanings are, right? So, talking about justice, about inequality, about redistribution of wealth.
Yeah.
So my what do you call that? My thing is that if if you're just obsessed about what do you call that? The liberal rights, the social liberal rights, right? In the West, that's one of the problems. There's social liberal rights that they focus on, and then you forget about the economic liberal rights, justice, better wages, better conditions. Then you risk alienating your public. And when that happens, is that then you get people who demagogues, populists, whether it's Donald Trump is a good example. You have the UKIP, and to a certain extent people like Boris Johnson as another, not so extreme, but to a certain extent, represent that sense. So then they lose out, right? And I could never imagine the UK being out of the European Union, but it happened because the European Union became irrelevant to many people, was seen as the enemy. In Malaysia, what is the risk? The risk, and it has always been our challenge, is how do we fight that racial dichotomy that you have? Because when the issue is actually economic. I know in my constituency, which is in KL, 10 kilometers from KLCC, I have Malay school dropouts. I have Chinese poor kids. I have Indians who do not get enough food to eat. And this is in KL. All right? This is the urban poor. So it cuts across all races. And I know the rich in my constituency are of all races as well.
Yeah.
And I know that I'm not saying, I'm not equating that as the same, but there's also those who exploit them.
Yes.
Those who come in and say, we fight for Malay rights. At the end of the day, they get the bulk of the contract to siphon off for their own interests.
Yeah.
And live lavishly, right? And their kids cannot even speak Malay because they go to international schools.
Yes. Yes.
They talk about hidup Melayu. And you have similar Chinese people who use that that identity politics. You have Indian leaders. You have Sabah Sarawak leaders. Similarly, you're talking about Sarawak for Sarawakians, but it's actually Sarawak for elite Sarawakians rather than for the normal Sarawakians. So it cuts across. But it's a very powerful tool because it's an identity that you feel kinship to, that you feel that you can relate to it. So what's my point? My point is that we cannot miss out on economic justice. My point was that one, of course, PH I think was doing a lot of things, a lot of good, but we failed in terms of communications.
Yes.
We did a few mistakes. For example, why did we push so hard on ICERT, on Rome Statute? Those are good things, but having the benefit of hindsight, we did not communicate it well. There was no engagement. So it created that fear factor in spite of countries like Saudi Arabia. I think they are both signatories to both statutes. They have kings. They have even harsher Islamic laws than us. And there's no problem. But we have been spooked by it because of lack of engagement. But more importantly, if we really focused, I think, in our first term on economic justice, on delivering for the poor, then we can make the case for then people wouldn't be so mindful when we want to talk about human rights and all that. So I think that is the danger. So any form of to survive in democracy is very challenging, especially in the age of social media. But as I think Winston Churchill said, right, it's the worst form. What do you call that? It's a bad form of government, but of all that we've tried, is the least worst. So it's very imperfect. It has its faults, but it's something that I think is that we have to accept, but we have to make people feel that they are part of it. And because Pakatan included under what do you call that? Included new voters. They are going to, which will enter the rolls next year. Those who are 18 years old, those who have never been registered before are now automatically registered. So we have to be very mindful because we do not know where these voters how these voters are going to vote. They have never voted before. This is just like I cannot do a TikTok video this generation they speak a different language, right? So I think that's where we politicians have to reach out and have to understand that generation or not. We can see what happened to US and UK in Malaysia. And that's last point. Although Biden won, and he did a remarkable thing. I think now it's over 300 electoral votes, the largest vote ever. But Trump is also the second largest vote ever for a presidential candidate. I think people thought that he would lose big. He didn't. So his coalition is still there, and I think that's something that progressives or social democrats, so to speak, must reflect.
Wow. Well, it's good. It's good that you mentioned that we've come to Trump and Biden, because that ultimately we can actually segue into this other thing. Because I was reading on your blog, YB, that that the Prime Minister and that the government of the day has to take our national sovereignty and defense seriously. What do you think the prospect of kind of a conflict erupting in the South China Sea, for example? And what do you mean by we have to take our defense and our borders seriously? Because it's obvious that militarily we are not. We're not. I'm not gonna say that we're weak, but we are. There's that. Even financially, we're not very particularly aggressive. We're not like Vietnam, who's constantly. Perhaps posturing, or perhaps showing some teeth, bearing that teeth at Chinese incursions into their territories and their waters. What do you think we should do? And a larger point on that question is, what do you think is going to happen with ASEAN, for example? Will it ever kind of like consolidate itself into a meaningful union? What do you think?
Well, yeah, I mean, we are, again, we are a country of 35 million, 25 million right now, something like that, people. So again, not big in the big scheme of things.
Yeah.
But we have to leverage. ASEAN is one example.
Yeah.
But the problem with ASEAN as well is that there are, for example, countries bordering China.
Yes.
The smaller ones. Vietnam, they have a history of fighting China, like I think goes back more than 1,000 years.
Yes.
So they have a strong sentiment against China.
Yes.
But Cambodia and Burma now is also tricky because I think the West is not really keen with what's happening to the Rohingyas. Laos, so they have a different relationship with China. So even Indonesia, I think because it's sometimes out of necessity because of there's only a few countries that are investing in ASEAN in a big way, and that includes our country, right? So I think that's where I'm not saying we can go out in the open, confrontationally with China.
Yeah.
But we really need to mention where our differences lie, and need them to understand that does not mean that we are, anti-China doesn't mean pro-America, for example. Right? So I think that is important, and I know it's not easy with this, especially because China is the China's assertiveness is greater under the current administration of Xi Jinping.
Yes.
So that is where it's a bit tricky, but we have done so. For example, in the Uyghur issue, many Muslim countries, even Saudi Arabia, I think they said that China has the best policy for Muslims or something, right? So to our credit, we did not. I think it started with under Pakatan Harapan, and then even under today's government, where we continue to defend Uyghur refugees, we send them to third countries instead of sending them back to China. It's understandable that we cannot make a big hoo-ha about it, but if you look at our history, although again we are a relatively small country, look at apartheid. Malaysia led the condemnation of apartheid in South Africa in the Commonwealth.
Yes.
Malaysia was vocal and even sent troops to help peacekeeping in Bosnia.
Yes.
So we have been playing our role. We have been punching above our weight.
Yes.
And I think we can, but it needs to be handled delicately. We need to have leadership. We really need transparent procurement systems for our military.
Yeah.
We unfortunately there's we have a history of either leakages, corruption, or inefficiencies in procurement.
Yes.
So even if we say maintain the percentage per GDP of our military spending, but if that amount of money all end up in military spending rather than profiteering and all that, then that's fine. Right? But the problem is we need to stop that, and I think it's something that we need to recognize because we during the Pakatan Harapan era we published the white paper and the defense white paper, and we have to recognize that we have a naval. Malaysia is unique in the sense that it's both a continental and also a naval country because of our coastlines. So the encroachment of foreign ships and all that, something that we have to pay attention.
That's interesting, because it's like because when China kind of like sailed one of the big battleships near our coastlines and near the Philippines, etc., it was the US who kind of like who also kind of like did an interception of that ship, which kind of like to me looks a lot like it's like how do we kind of balance that, because it's like on one hand you have like these two superpowers, kind of like playing hide and seek in our backyard, which is make. I mean, like maybe for most Malaysians, it might not be a concern out of innocent ignorance, but it's like that was a worrying thing. But I want to go back to, for example, the government's handling of certain things. So Malaysia in 2020 was named by UNESCO as World Book Capital 2020 in Kuala Lumpur, for example. And I was at the launch of World Book Capital, for example, and I met the UN representative, for example, one Mr. Ian, I think was his name, and he said, and I realized that even before COVID, there was a very lackluster effort by the authorities of the capital. This is not some city in the north, ni bukan apa kampung ke apa calang-calang ang punya local government. This is the capital's authority, DBKL, etc. And why has there been such a lackluster response to this? Because it goes back to education. If we look at the research, for example, in an average American home, middle class, who gives their children proper education, who make it to the universities and will get opportunities economically later on in life, they have about 200, 300, 400 books on average in their household, which shows that they actually have access to education, which shows that they actually use those resources in order to become better informed and obtain new skills. I mean, Michael Faraday himself did not go to school. Michael Faraday worked for a bookbinder, and he read everything while he was there. Yeah. And so it's like, why is it that the government itself, which is supposedly in charge of education, in charge of educating the rakyat and taking care of us in that sense, why has it had such I'm sorry to say, and I'm not blaming the government, but it was objectively, I would say, a pathetic response and a pathetic effort by the local government. What do you say to that, and what can we do to improve it or save it? Because it goes on until 2021.
Yeah, I was the chair of Selangor Public Library Corporation, right?
Yes.
And I know it is a major challenge. It's multifaceted. I mean, even to the fundamental thing, right? When we talk about our education ministry budget, until today, I mean, I have schools, and this is in KL. You can imagine what's outside KL. Government schools, secondary schools. It's a new school. They have a nice building. They have a library but they do not have budget for books. Right? So I come in, I give whatever, I do book banks and, gather publishers and all that with what I can, or give some money, whatever. So, but, that's the thing. And I think, you can blame, and people like to say Malaysians do not like to read. Or the other thing is that Malays do not like to read. Or if they do, they read, novel cinta or buku agama yang, I mean, again, buku agama is good, but there's also various types of buku agama, right? So, but if you do not even to the most basic thing of provide books for your school libraries, how are you going to expect the public to respond? And I think it's something that we need to look into. To inculcate a habit, we really need to invest in books. We saw a lot of I think that was 5 years ago, where we had a lot of indie publishers prospering. Obviously now I think a lot of them are either closed or in difficulty because of the various factors, including COVID. But I think that was something that for me was something that was really interesting. There's nothing wrong. I think if again, looking at, for example, the type of books that people read and all that, you want to adjust to the market and all that. Because for me, at the end of the day,
Yeah,
Reading is the first step,
yeah,
right?
that's
Even if
true.
it's a novel cinta, it's a novel cinta, but
That's
you know,
true.
as a first step, and but holding a book is very important.
Mm.
Then again, I mean that you need to work on various levels, because again, if you grow up in a household, for example, where your parents do not read, I read. I have these books behind me because I grew up in a household that had books like this in
Yeah.
our home. So it's something that's it's quite normal.
Yes.
But not everyone is blessed like that. So I think that is where you know, we just need to inculcate more campaigns. You know, there were efforts, right? ITBM and DBP and all that. I don't know. I mean, I don't know the details, to be honest.
Yeah.
But why can't they be put under DBP, right?
There's a lot of politics involved. YB.
Yes.
Yeah.
So
A lot of
I think, you know, why do we replicate these things, duplicate these things unnecessarily? And I think it needs to be considered.
I mean, it's interesting that you say that, because in terms of libraries, etc., because it's like, I think it's the fault of whoever is in charge of these banks of knowledge, we can call it, these libraries. For example, Andrew Carnegie, when he died, he donated his fortune to build public libraries all across the United States, right? And
Yeah.
when we go to libraries today, and I go to KL Library, etc., it's a ghost town, unfortunately.
You
And
should go to the. Have you been to the Shah Alam Library?
the one in
The State
golf
Library.
course, yes,
Yeah.
I have been.
Mm.
I have been, and it's a nice library, you know, but not very strategic. And the selection of books, in my opinion, is lacking, because it's like, even in the US, what we found is that the books are hideously expensive. I mean, we have there's on record, and I can show you the sources later, which I'm sure will be quite interesting, because even university professors who are ex emeritus from UCL, University of Southern California, for example, grew up middle class, you know, good, Jewish man. He could not afford these journals, and it's like they go up to like 100, 200 US dollars. It's like it's interesting. So how do we improve libraries, for example, in Malaysia?
Yeah, I mean, like, okay, I have a personal experience. Like in the Selangor Library, again, we cater to the market, right? So I think that was a thing, and but what we tried to do is something that preceded me. In fact, the location was because the previous government had already moved it there.
Yes.
So, but what we did was, you know, one of the things is to make it fun and exciting. And it is child centric, I guess, you know, children centric. And there's like games, there's creative spaces. So the idea is to attract the kids to come to the Selangor Library.
Yeah.
I agree that the selection of books can be better and all that, but partly is catering to the market.
Yes.
And the idea is also, we're not making it just that, you know, just like a monument, a big one, a giant in Shah Alam, you know, a very nice area. But Selangor Library has over, I think now, probably 100 libraries in total.
Yes.
So they even do the small libraries that they do. We did one in a low-cost flat in Kampung Lindungan, in PJ.
Yeah.
So that one also, we have similar designs, very colorful, lots of books. So that is important. Books are very expensive. English books especially.
Yeah.
But that's why I'm trying to create, like, for my constituency, I have a book bank. I also realize that there are, partly because of space, partly because of, I mean, some people that I have one book, people will give me the same title.
Yes.
Right? So I said, rather than, you know, why should I have both? I'll put it in my book bank. I get publishers to do the same, and we do give that so to schools like that, or even to the low cost areas. But yeah, it takes a lot of time.
Yes.
And you need to push it through, and I guess it's more of a challenge today. During my generation, it was just a TV.
Yes.
Like you say, oh, budak tak nak baca buku sebab ada TV. Now, what do you call that? now is the gadgets, right? And the gadgets are from an intuitive perspective is very powerful, right? A kid that does not know how to read or spell will know how to use an iPad. So that is what we are up against. I don't have the easy challenge. I mean, my own son, we get him to read, but both Malay and English. But again, I mean, for him to pick up a book, it's not easy, right? So I think that's where parents were stressed. Parents were doing 2 jobs.
Yes.
And all that. You know what's the easiest thing to keep that kid quiet, which I do as well. Give them a gadget. Right? So that is something that we are up against, which is we've never had that before.
Yeah. YB.
All right.
Nik Nazmi,
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for being on Tapir Table. It's been a pleasure having you on. We hope to have you on again someday. And Firdaus, do you have anything else to say?
Just to yang berbahagia, do you have any special message, shout out to Malaysians and to your constituency, or even to your daughters or sons?
Well, I think we are living in extraordinary times, testing times. Hopefully we'll look back at this one day and say, we managed to see how the spirit of kita jaga kita can bring us to go beyond what we've encountered. But the most important thing I think is to always maintain that sense of compassion, to always maintain that sense of putting ourselves in someone else's shoe. I guess we all have our own challenges, our own difficulties. Maybe it's economically, socially, what do you call that? Mentally, psychologically, health-wise, whatever. So but we need to look and we always believe that we are blessed in one way or another, and we can help each other out. And hopefully get through this difficult time.
Inshallah. All right. YB, thank you so much for your generous giving us your time.
Thank you very much for your time.
Yeah, sure, no problem. My pleasure.
All right.
YB.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, bye.
Okay, bye.